Whenever you're ready, we can get started.
Great. Hey, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Chauncey Goss. I'm chairman of the South Florida Water Management District Governing Board. And the board is very pleased today to be able to present today's Lunch and Learn on the Central Florida Water Initiative, also known as the CFWI, the Regional Water Supply Planning Update for that. The governing board and the public, the governing board is on this call, and the public also is on the call, are going to be provided a brief history of the CFWI and the regional water supply planning efforts, and an overview of the 2020 CFWI Regional Water Supply Plan, and that's going to be presented to the board for approval at a future meeting. As in the past, I'm going to ask the governing board members with questions to raise your hands electronically during the presentation, and I'll call on you when I see your hands go up in the order I see your hands go up. Also, as a reminder, today's Lunch and Learn is informative. We're not going to be taking any actions or any votes. At the end of the presentation, we're going to take public comment for the record. We'll have staff call your name to speak when we take public comment. If you're participating by phone, *6 is going to mute and unmute you, and *9 is going to raise your hand. I'll try and remind you of that. Before we start, I'd like to remind everyone that Lunch and Learn sessions typically have a 1 p.m. hard stop. I'd like to continue that practice. And now I'd like to turn the presentation over to Mark Elsner, who's the Bureau Chief for Water Supply. Mark?
All right, hold on. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Mark.
Okay. All right, so as Mr. Goss indicated, I'm Mark Elsner, Water Supply Bureau Chief with the South Florida Water Management District. And today I want to present an overview of the Central Florida Water Initiative, the factors that have led up to its formation, a little bit about the history, but I really want to spend most of the time to focus on what's happening today. The first regional water supply plan for the Central Florida Water Initiative was approved in 2015. The 5-year update to that plan is nearing completion. The draft 2020 plan has been completed and is currently out for public review. So today I'll talk about what the CFWI is, talk about the groundwater resources and other supplies available, a little bit about the history, snapshot of what the CFWI 2015 Regional Water Supply Plan concluded, and then an overview of the current 2020 draft. As Mr. Goss indicated, this is for information purposes and to get you familiar with the draft plan that will be coming to you later this year for consideration. So Central Florida Water Initiative planning area includes Orange, Osceola, Seminole, Polk, and Southern Lake counties. It's an area in Central Florida where the 3 water management districts meet. And unfortunately, the groundwater resources don't follow those political boundaries and the necessity for us to have this coordinated and collaborative approach. In this area, we have 50 local governments, the city of Orlando being the largest. There's also currently about 3 million people that call Central Florida home. And if you've been up there, it's expanding rapidly in all directions. As you know, Central Florida is also an international tourist destination with Disney World, Universal Studios, and many more attractions. Another part of Central Florida is there is a major agricultural industry. There's currently about 135,000 acres of agriculture under irrigation, primarily citrus, followed by sod. About 60% of that agriculture is within the Southwest Florida Water Management District, while the remaining 40% is split 20% between South Florida and St. John's. In addition, the CFWI planning area contains extensive natural systems, the headwaters to the Peace River, 13 springs, and over 1 million acres of wetlands. So with all these needs, water dependent, is testament of why we need to have this collaborative approach. The CFWI effort is extremely collaborative process between DEP, St. Johns River Water Management District, South Florida Water Management District, Southwest Florida Water Management District, the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, regional public water supply utilities, environmental groups, and other stakeholders. Okay, before we actually get into the process, let's talk about that water resources. Here's a cross-section of the aquifer system that underlies Central Florida. If you were to go ahead and slice it and pick this wedge up, this is what you would see. You have a superficial aquifer system, a limited intermediate aquifer system, and then you have the Floridan aquifer system. The superficial and intermediate aren't very productive. However, the Floridan aquifer system is very productive. About 90% of the water used in this region comes from the Floridan aquifer system, and a very minor amount from the other two aquifers. I'd like to point out this aquifer is semi-confined, meaning that there's a semi-impermeable rock layer between the Floridan aquifer system and above. And I'll get into the extent of the Floridan aquifer system, that a lot of the recharge for this aquifer comes from up north. But there's also places where this semi-confining unit is absent. And in those areas, recharge can occur, but also the Floridan aquifer system is artesian, meaning in certain areas of the planning area where the land surface is low enough and the pressure in the Floridan aquifer system is high enough that it does create flow at the surface. And that's why you see springs in the area. So you can see that there's a lot of dependency on the aquifer system, and when we withdraw water from the Floridan aquifer system, it does draw down the superficial system to a certain extent, but also can affect spring flow and other natural systems. So the Floridan aquifer system is an expansive aquifer and stretches from southern Georgia the whole way through Florida. It's a very productive aquifer and produces very good quality water. In the Central Florida area, the water quality is very good. There are several utilities that only provide filtration and disinfection before sending the water out to drinking. As you go from north to south, the Floridan aquifer is fresh, and as you go south, it gets saltier. And when we say the Floridan aquifer system, like in the lower East Coast region, it's the same aquifer, but it's much more saltier once you get south of Lake Okeechobee, and requires desalination treatment before use. Okay, I'm not going to ruin the story, but I want to talk about the conclusion and some of the realities of the plan. And I'll go into much more detail as I get later in the presentation, but wanted to at least set the stage. Currently, we have use of around 660 million gallons a day. Through this effort, we've determined that the groundwater availability is probably between 660 million gallons a day and 760 million gallons a day, as represented by this yellow line. So based on our demand projections, we could be exceeding that availability in the next 5 years. To help meet this need, our projected water demand is about 855 of groundwater in 2040. We've identified 532 million gallons a day of project options and about 50 million gallons a day of conservation. And I will point out the last bar here of we have permitted groundwater allocations over 1 billion gallons a day. And I'll talk a little more about that later. Okay, so the history of the CFWI. It's been a growing area. We've seen increasing demands for water. There's been competition for water, and in the 2000s, litigation between suppliers over the availability and the permitting process. We were seeing impacts to natural systems, and that each water management district was doing individual water supply planning. And each one of those plans did identify increasing impacts to the resource over time. Yeah, that was recognized, and the 3 water management districts got together and formed what they called the Central Florida Coordination Area. And that evolved into the CFWI in 2011. Okay. So the 3 water management districts agreed in 2006 to the Central Florida Coordination Area Action Plan. And the plan was to address short and long-term development of water supplies in Central Florida. The CFCA, as we refer to it, consisted of 2 phases. In phase 1, a framework was established to address the short-term resource issues. We knew that there were water needs that needed to be addressed within the next 5 years, but then there was a longer-term effort that was needed. So phase 1 concluded in 2008 with interim water use regulations that limited groundwater withdrawals to projected 2013 demands and required development of alternative water supplies to meet the future needs. And an important part of this was those interim rules were sunsetted or ended on December 31st, 2012. It was anticipated that we would have a longer term approach and rules in place to address the needs of this area. Phase 2 of the CFCA action plan began in 2009 with the primary objective to establish new rules prior to the sunsetting date to implement a long-term approach to resource management in Central Florida. This phase involved coordinated activities on a variety of issues, including regional water supply planning, investigation and development of traditional and alternative water supplies, assessment of environmental impacts and groundwater sustainability, and development of consistent water use rules and permitting criteria for this area. Acknowledging we probably needed a more formal process and to bring additional stakeholders into the process, the CFWI was created in 2011 and incorporated much of that CFCA phase 2 process. So it's such a large effort. You needed organization. You had 3 water management districts. You had the different agencies, water users, utilities, agriculture, and other users, and environmental organizations. So this organization structure is unique to any other water supply planning effort. You have a steering committee, which is the policy body for this organization, that provides guidance to the technical teams in what we call the management oversight committee. And the steering committee would provide the direction. The management oversight committee, which consisted of managers from many of the agencies, water management districts, and other stakeholders, would take that guidance and go ahead and vet it through a series of technical teams. And these technical teams, identified in the tan boxes here, would consisted of representatives from each of the districts, the agencies, and stakeholders, and they would take on the technical part of this and analysis. The water resource assessment team did included hydraulic analysis, the data monitoring and investigations, which I'll get into in a minute. The environmental measures team, MFL and reservations, groundwater availability. And then across the board, each of those teams had specific requirements or specific direction. Talking more about the steering committee, Here are the representatives representing the different organizations on that steering committee. And our own Mr. Butler represents the South Florida Water Management District and had his first meeting in February. And so to sort of formalize the process and the directives, the steering committee's direction is captured in what we call the guiding document. And this is a dynamic document that's updated periodically. And the purpose of it is to guide the process and something we have to refer to the overarching principles, but also directives to each of those technical teams. And the primary principles are identify sustainable quantities of groundwater sources. We know the demands are increasing. We need to have a sustainable water supply. We need to do that as part of this effort. We need to develop strategies on how to meet those demands. And then because we have 3 water management districts, we need to have consistent rules. And with the consistent rules, with the 3 water management districts coming together, we have the same implementing statutes. We have then each water management district have developed rules to implement those statutes. And permits are issued. You know, one of the parts of this is, as part of the permitting process, they are looking at sort of regional, sub-regional impacts. But the reality is that this is the aquifer's large. We need to look at this on a more regional approach, and the need for consistent rules and an approach going forward. All right. So water supply plan looks at 20 years into the future. For this effort, we're planning out to 2040. The plan takes into account projected water demands and needs, projected growth, weighs that against available supply, and identify where traditional sources cannot meet those needs, in this case, the Florida Aquifer System, and identify a series of project options, primarily alternative water supply and water conservation, to go ahead and meet those needs. One thing I do want to focus on is what is a plan and do and what doesn't it do. And primarily this is a proactive approach towards water supply. We know there's going to be increased demands for water in the future. So the water supply plan lets us get ahead of those demands by identifying the sources and strategies now on how those demands are going to be met while meeting the needs of natural resources. Want to emphasize this is a planning level approach. We do project future water demands and identifies and evaluates the water source options. What a water supply plan doesn't do is it doesn't authorize consumptive use permits. That's another level of analysis that's needed. It doesn't establish MFLs. There's already a rule process for that, although the plan does incorporate MFLs in its analysis. It doesn't adopt rules. We'll talk about it a little later, but one of the outcomes of a plan could be rulemaking. And it doesn't require water users to implement specific projects, meaning we create a set of options for which water users can choose to meet their needs and tailor to their specific situation. Okay. So I mentioned the first plan was done in 2015, and there were a series of documents. It was the 2015 Regional Water Supply Plan, but we also put together the 2015 Water Resources Protection and Water Supply Strategies Plan. And what that did was take the options and then further develop some of those strategies and potential projects, and looking at how those would affect some of the impacts that we were seeing. That document was approved in November of 2015. You know, as part of that effort, the plan concluded that current and future water demands can be met through 2035 while sustaining water resource and related natural systems. However, it concluded that the traditional source of water, the upper Florida aquifer, will not be able to supply the water needed for projected demands, and that increased conservation and alternative water supplies would have to be developed to meet those needs. It did identify 150 project options that could produce up to 466 million gallons a day. One project scenario was costed out at about $2.8 billion for the additional 225 shortfall that was identified. And as part of that, development of consistent regulations within this area. So in 2015, the steering committee did a couple of different actions. First, it endorsed the 2015 Regional Water Supply Plan and encouraged the Water Management District Governing Boards to approve the plan. It also directed continuation of effort to advance conservation beyond those estimates that were identified in the 2015 plan. It also directed staff to continue working on the model, the East Central Florida transient model, which was used for the groundwater assessments, and updating that with more geologic information and more knowledge that was gained since its development. And then it directed development of consistent rule framework. So in reality, we actually started on the 2020 update before the 2015 plan was approved. The other thing I wanted to mention is that we don't start from scratch on these water supply plans. We benefit from all the work that was done previously and build on those findings and effort. Okay, to further implementation of conservation, the conservation team continued to work, and it was developed in concert with stakeholders. And they developed the conservation implementation strategy that was approved by the steering committee in October of 2019. And the strategy included a status assessment and quantifying water savings since 2010. And it looked at best management practices for conservation by use type and quantified the potential savings that could be realized through 2035. It also looked at additional measures out in addition to what was considered in the 2015 plan. Another big part of this effort is the data management investigations team. This is the group that is responsible for looking at the data, identifying data gaps, and developing a plan on how we can get that data. It includes wetland monitoring with transects and superficial aquifer wells, regional water level monitoring of the superficial aquifer system, upper Floridan and lower Floridan. It also, the team also considers parameters such as water quality and rainfall. And if you look at on this map here, the different colors and the different symbols indicate wetland monitoring or drilling of wells. And then the status is in the different colors. So the 5-year work plan is now a 10-year work plan going from 2015 to 2025, has a total estimated cost of about $25 million. Of that cost, South Florida is responsible for about 22% of that. To date, we've invested or budgeted about $3.6 million, or we're about 35% complete. Okay, as I indicated, we used a tool called the East Central Florida Transient Groundwater Model to do the groundwater assessments in this area. It was developed by the USGS, modified by district staff and stakeholders to make it useful for a planning tool. At the direction of the steering committee and identifying that the boundaries of it created boundary effects in the assessment in the 2015 plan, we were directed to go ahead and expand that. And so in 2020, we expanded it to 25,000 square miles and added the word expanded. So now the tool is the East Central Florida Transient Expanded, ECFTX. And you can see here that the area of this orange line, this is the boundary of the 2015 model. It was expanded to the area represented enclosed by this blue line. You know, in addition to that, took the opportunity to provide major upgrades to the model. Besides the expansion, and this included improved water use data, consensus-based hydrogeology and model layering, incorporation of recent data to support the calibration, and that data that was being collected by the data management and investigations team was inputted into the model during the calibration. And we also included an independent peer review panel during the model development to provide input and oversight while these changes were being done and calibration accomplished. The ECFTX model is a much more robust tool than what was used in 2015. I do need to emphasize that the ECFTX model is a planning level tool and was used in this process to predict potential impacts on wetland water levels, lake water levels, spring flows, and groundwater levels caused by current and projected groundwater withdrawals. The other part of the 2015 steering committee direction was to do uniform rules. And actually, there was a 2016 amendment to Florida statutes that required DEP to adopt uniform rules for water use permitting in the Central Florida Water Initiative area. Rulemaking was initiated in December of 2016, and it's being led by DEP. And there's been a series of workshops over the past several years, and that effort is continuing. All right, for the 2020 Regional Water Supply Plan, as I indicated, it was made available for public review. That was March 13th, and the comment period ends May 15th. In addition, and here it lays out the different chapters. So in addition to the executive summary, there's 9 other chapters that provide summaries of the projections, analysis, project options, water sources, and conclusions, and then talks about what the next steps are. This plan is much more streamlined for the readers than our 2015 plan. The main plan went from 230 pages down to 120 pages. All right, this table shows the demands for each of the 6 categories that we project water demands for. But the basis for these demands are down below here, and that for population, the University of Florida Bureau of Economic and Business Research is projecting that the population in this area is going to increase from about 3 million people, to about 4.4 million people, about a 49% increase by 2040. Using information from the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, the plan is estimating that irrigated agriculture will remain relatively stable over through 2040. As you can see here, here's our demand categories. And then there's my laser. And then our 2015 estimated demands. the 2040, the projected demands, taking into account these inputs. And as you can see, we're projecting a 36% increase in total water demand. That changes about 240 million gallons a day with a total demand of about 907 million gallons a day. Public water supply is the largest use in this area, and we're projecting it to continue to be that way through 2040. And they make up about 53%, or they have a 53% change over the next 20 years. Okay, this slide shows just the historic and projected water demands versus population. This black line here shows the population, and then the stack bar shows the increase in demand over time. And the different colors represent the different user categories that I mentioned earlier. And as you can see, the slope of the demand is lesser than what population is. And that's an effect of the efficient use of reclaimed water and implementation of conservation in this area, offsetting the groundwater demands. Since 1995, the gross per capita rate has decreased 23% to about 140 gallons per day per person. And in this area, over 95% of the treated wastewater is reused. That equates to about 210 million gallons a day for a beneficial purpose, mainly for irrigation. Okay, as part of the development of the plan, the technical teams were tasked with addressing groundwater availability in the planning area. We developed what we call environmental measures to assess the groundwater availability. And these included 39 minimum flow and level water bodies and related category criteria. It also included 29 lakes and wetlands, 6 springs, 2 of which are outstanding Florida springs, and then 1 river segment. In addition, there were several water use caution area criteria that are part of the Southwest Florida Southern water use caution area, which is over here. And where you see the squares, those are the areas where the criteria were looked at, and the different color schemes show where MFLs aren't currently being met, MFLs that won't be met in the 2030 and 2040 conditions, and so on. Wetlands were also analyzed as part of the groundwater availability work. The technical team's analysis focused on groundwater dominated wetlands that could be affected by groundwater pumping. And that's about 20% of the over 1 million acres of wetlands that are identified in this area. So the groundwater availability assessment, doing these model runs using the criteria. In 2014, we estimated there was about 620 million gallons a day of water being withdrawn. And at that time, there were 11 MFLs and MFL related criteria that weren't being met, and about 33,000 acres of wetlands that were being impacted. As demand grew over the series of runs, the freeboard in these minimum flows and level water bodies and other related water bodies continued to decrease, and by 2030, 2 additional MFLs were tripped, and then increasing stress to the natural systems in the way of wetlands. All right, so using that information, This is the chart that I had shown at the beginning. The planning level groundwater availability assessment indicates that above 760, we see additional triggering of MFL criteria. So we're estimating that water availability is somewhere between 660 and 760. To reach that 760, the plan does identify that local management options would have to occur, and that could be well field operations, recharge, and additional wells. The plan does identify 532 million gallons a day of project options in about 85 different projects, and I'll talk about those in a minute, and also 50 million gallons a day of water conservation. Something that is a relevant issue, and I mentioned this earlier, is that that something that will need to be addressed is dealing with the overallocation issue. And we'll need to work with the other water management districts to align the this planning level information with permitting and dealing with the overallocation issue. And I'll say it's not going to be a simple solution, but it's one that we have to come to grips with. Talking about water conservation, here are the projected water savings that are contained in the plan. As I indicated on the previous slide, we've identified about 50 million gallons a day of conservation savings through 2040. And as you would imagine, since public water supply is the largest user, it was estimated that the largest savings could be made within that user category. So to meet that deficit between the groundwater availability and the total water demand, we've identified 85 projects that could make available over 530 million gallons a day. And this slide breaks down the different options. We have the Floridan Aquifer, which is a traditional source of water. And these here at the top would be considered alternatives. We have brackish groundwater, and on that first slide, the wedge, it actually underlies the upper Floridan Aquifer system, which is the primary aquifer used in this area. In certain parts, it is brackish. We have management strategies. We're going to see continued use of reclaimed water. It's been an integral part of the water supply picture today, and that'll continue into the future. And the largest alternative water supply that the plan identifies is through surface water. The plan does identify a series of potential funding options, and these range from water supplier user funding, water management district funding, state funding, all the way to federal funding. Yeah, and we do see potential for public-private partnerships, cooperatives, and other investments. So the plan concludes that although groundwater sources are limited, the 2020 Regional Water Supply Plan that concludes that current and future water demands can be met through 2040 while sustaining water resources and natural systems. To do this, the plan identifies that it is going to have to be an integrated approach, and it's going to include increased water conservation. It is going to require development of alternative water supplies. We need to continue with our hydrogeologic investigations to better understand the aquifer systems, and especially that lower Floridan aquifer, and that there's not a lot of wells that have tapped that. So a lot of that DMIT work that I talked about earlier has wells going into the lower Floridan, so that we can gather more information as we continue to plan for this area. Funding is going to be a big part of this. With the alternatives, there is an increased cost associated with that. And then as we've talked, development of consistent rules and regulations for this area between the water management districts. Our schedule, we had presented this draft plan to the steering committee in February, and they approved release of it for public review. We're presenting to the governing boards February through April, as we're doing today. As I indicated, our public comment period began March 13th, and it'll conclude May 15th. We're also hosting public workshops and webinars. These were originally planned to be in-person meetings, but given the situation, we're using technology. We had our first public workshop last week, and the second workshop is planned for tomorrow. Following the public review period, we'll be working on those comments that we've received and updating where appropriate the draft document, and then working with the Management Oversight Committee on the updated draft, and ultimately going to the steering committee in October, and plan to go to the individual governing boards for your consideration in November. You know, and what are we doing here? Hopefully, our strategy is that we need to identify sufficient water sources to meet our needs, you know, while not impacting our natural resources, and have a sustainable water source for generations to come. So the investments we make today is for those future generations, and making sure that all the needs can be met while not harming our valuable natural systems. And with that, that concludes my presentation.
Hey, Mark, thank you very much. That was incredibly informative and very interesting. If any board member has a question for Mark, go ahead and raise your hand now. Mark, I've got one for you. I'll start off. You had said that, you know, the way we're split up, we've got, I guess 20% of the agriculture is in our district, 20% in South Florida, and then 60% in Southwest Florida. Do you have that same breakout for non-ag, for sort of the big municipal users? It's just, you know, where do most of the people live, and who's drawing most of the water that isn't ag between the three districts?
Yeah, we do have that. I don't have that off the top of my head, but it's in that Central Florida area. You have Orange County Utilities, Orlando Utilities Commission, Polk County is a big user. And as you go north out of the area, we have Toho and Kissimmee, and then municipals as you go out the I-4 corridor and north. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but I can get that.
Yeah, if you could at some point, it would be helpful for me just to be able to sort of frame, since this is a sort of an interesting intersection of three different water management districts, just to sort of know who's got what for the most part. Mr. Lipich, you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thank you very much. This is Jackie Thurlow Lippish. Mark, could you please tell me the names of the 6 springs that are in the area? I tried to look it up online, but I could not identify them, especially the 2 first magnitude. And my second question is, was this born from the South Florida Water Management District, or whose idea was this originally? And was it, you know, I mean, let's be honest here. Was it kind of for development purposes, because this part of the state, I mean, I think like the airport is in this area. There are a lot of huge, important entities that are in this area. What was the motivation? And, you know, based on our mission, our new mission, how are the springs doing? Thanks.
Yes. Okay, none of the springs are in our area. The 2 outstanding Florida springs are Rock and Wickawa. I don't have the names of the others.
It's Wekiva.
Yeah.
Wekiva Springs and Rock
Yes,
Springs.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a park at Wekiva Springs. It's a pretty popular spring.
Yeah, it's a a neat area that if you're looking for a field trip, that's a nice area to visit. And as far as the development of at that time, the CFCA, it was really all three water management districts coming together. We do have a memorandum of understanding that we coordinate permitting along the district boundaries. You know, and as part of that effort and some of the litigation that we were experiencing in the early 2000s, it was evident that a regional approach was needed and that we couldn't do this on a permit by permit basis, and that we needed a framework for how those water use permits were going to be issued. And at that time, it was the Central Florida Coordination Area, and as I explained, evolved into the Central Florida Water Initiative. And we still continue coordination along the boundaries, along with this tremendous effort as part of the Central Florida Water Initiative.
Okay, I really appreciate you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Butler, you're our liaison to the CFWI, and I want to thank you very much for doing that. And if you have any questions, you can go ahead.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just, one thing, Mark, you and I have talked about it a little bit, and you've kind of given me a little bit of education, but talking about the confining layers between the upper Floridian and lower Floridian, can you and you mentioned that we need more science, and basically that's done through putting some wells in, but can you kind of elaborate on the kind of the unknowns there, and unknowns and potential risk that exists there between the upper and
Certainly.
lower?
I'm going to go back up. To that wedge. Yep. So this system, and the one thing I wanted to mention as part of this, and I did later in the presentation, that we have the Floridan Aquifer system, and we have the upper Floridan Aquifer and the lower Floridan Aquifer. And there's actually some semi-confinement between these two. But a lot of the use in this area has been coming from the upper Floridan Aquifer. So a lot of these wells just go right into this area here. And it's not extensive across the planning area. So we need to increase our knowledge about where this semi-confined unit is and not. And we have a pretty good idea because there has been a number of wells that have penetrated it, but very few wells have gone into this deeper lower Floridan. So is for our use of our model, it's calibrated on the data that we have, albeit somewhat limited, and that data management investigations team work plan has a number of wells that are looking to go down to about 2,000 to 2,500 feet deep to understand the geology in this area, the water quality. And as they're drilling these, they're taking rock cores, bringing them back to analyze them. We're doing what we call pumpage tests to find where the main flow patterns are within each of these areas. You know, as well as doing geologic modeling, so that it helps us better understand the layering here so that we can improve our knowledge and the groundwater tool that we're using to assess this area. You know, in these wells, they do take months, many months to drill. It's not like you go out in a couple of days and get that information. With our wells, they're taking 6 to 8 months of continuous drilling to make that happen.
And I've heard some anecdotes from a few landowners within the district, within our district boundaries, that I think on some of their wells that I believe are in the upper Floridian, that they're beginning to deal with some brackish type issues. And just curious what some of the research or some of the existing wells we have, are we seeing any of that, or is that
yeah, but I think that's a really good point. And as we develop into the future and look at our water supply here, we want to make sure that we don't draw more water out of the upper Floridan than can recharge laterally and create vertical movement of this salt water up. So that's one of the things we are looking at. Water quality is a part of this. Our tool doesn't look at water quality, but we look at different changes in water levels to determine areas where that potential is. But that is a valid concern, Mr. Butler, and that is part of this effort and our data investigations work.
And Mr. Butler, this is Lawrence. There are areas, especially around Lake Okeechobee, where there is remnant connate water. So, sometimes maybe they'll have a well in one area, and if they drill into another area and they hit that connate water is basically remnant salt water that is still in the ground. So that increases as you get around the lake. And Mark can speak a little better to that, but that is something that does happen in the region around the lake.
It's interesting. Well, I think it's great to see that with this new model run, that they've expanded the boundaries, because it, in reality, I mean, it's one complete system, and I'm glad to see that the initiative to kind of look at everything. Swapping gears just a little bit, how, we talk about alternative water supply projects. Can you kind of give us an idea of what the general broad different types of projects are proposed? I think you had the one graph, but how does it break out between districts? Are we all kind of the same, proposing the same type of projects, or are we kind of regionalized on the project ideas? And with that, what kind of funding are the districts putting into those type of projects?
Yep. So this slide, we did talk about the different options, or the categories of options. And, brackish water there's projects, proposed options across all three districts. And reclaim water projects across all districts. So the primary urban hubs is where the reclaimed water is going to be. Surface water, looking at the St. Johns River, but also you may have heard of the Groveland Reservoir project located in Okeechobee, St. Lucie, and Indian River counties. That's not in the planning area, but the potential of moving that water north to supplement flows to the St. Johns River and to offset some of the withdrawals. So that's included in this plan also. In the way of, and then you have stormwater capture projects of being able to capture rainwater at the time it falls and storing it for a later use. So in the way of the breakout, and one of the unique things about this area is that utilities their service areas expand and extend into different water management districts. So your question is a little more difficult to answer, in that Orange County serves population both in South Florida and St. John's. Polk County Utilities is in South Florida as well as Southwest Florida. But what I will say is that, because some of the issues we're seeing are regional, applaud water users, and that they've formed a couple different groups. We have the Central Florida Water Group, which is made up of St. Cloud, Toho, Orange County, Reedy Creek, and Polk County Utilities, that have formed a group formally through agreements, and they're looking at their existing demands, their future demands, and the sources to go ahead and meet those. And one project they're looking at is a brackish water project, and that Toho has what they call the Cypress Lakes Wellfield. And instead of each entity developing a lower Floridan wellfield and a reverse osmosis facility and a concentrate disposal system. They're working together and have Toho develop that and then construct a pipeline system that would then be able to distribute large volumes of water to the different member organizations. So that way you're sort of being as efficient and cost effective as you can. Another effort that's happened since 2015 is formation of the Polk County Regional Cooperative, where all the utilities in Polk County in this area have got together and formally formed an organization to address their water needs. And they're looking at everything from conservation to stormwater capture to development of brackish water and reverse osmosis. So it, you know, there's efficiencies to be had scaling these projects and working together, and we applaud those areas for coming together and trying to address their water supply in cooperation with each other.
Mr. Butler, with respect to the funding, you know, a lot of the projects are utility projects, you know, because that's where you're experiencing the most growth. And so the funding of alternative water supply primarily comes from the utility, but there is cost share available depending on where you are. Governor DeSantis this year received his ask of $40 million in alternative water supply, so he could bring funds to the table to you know, buy into those kinds of efforts. And he did it, requested again, and got it again this year. And so the district did fund a number of alternative water supply with that state money. Southwest Florida Water Management District, they've had a long history of water supply challenges, you know, starting with around Tampa Bay and now in Polk County, which predated this effort with a Southern Water Use Caution Area. And so they've, just the way they're structured, they do bring a lot of funds to the table for alternative water supply just through their history. Whereas our district, you know, a lot of our efforts and draw for our funds has gone towards Everglades restoration and, you know, rebuilding the CNSF system and making sure our water is right with respect to that water management. So we haven't been able to bring district funds, that much district funds, to alternative water supply in the CFWI area. So we've been relying on state funds to contribute to our efforts.
Okay, and that's I appreciate that, Drew. That's kind of what I thought I'd heard, and I was trying to get that point out, that that there may be some opportunities there that other districts are doing, that we may be able to fund some of these projects that kind of help out in this area, especially we begin to see some issues within our service area of some water supply quality issues.
Mm-hmm.
But, no, I appreciate that, Drew.
Sure.
Ms. Mead.
Mark, I'm wondering if you could just tell us in general just a little bit about the litigation that led to the creation of this project.
I think Jennifer Brown, are you on the line?
Sure.
Would
Good
you be able
afternoon,
to
board
answer
members. Yes, the South Florida Water Management District had issued a permit to one of the larger utilities up there, and then several other utilities, as well as the St. Johns River Water Management District, challenged that permit, and it was a DOA litigation action, you know, questioning demand and then what impacts those demand might cause. And DEP said, hey, water management districts, knock it off, sit down together, work out the issues, make sure if you're seeing a problem, we have a process that will jointly address the regional impacts. And so what we did was issue several of the utilities' water use permits at the same time so that everybody could see what everybody else got. We had done some interim rules, as Mark described, that were termed the CFCA rules. And what we did was limit the demands that utilities could request to 2013. So essentially we were saying, if you want a volume of water, you're not going to get more than the Bieber or other demand projections would say that you need by 2013. And so those permits that we had issued were all issued with those rules in place. Everybody saw what everybody else got. And so the litigation was resolved. And we started then the phase 2 effort that Mark had described.
Thank you.
Thanks. I have a question, Mark, on your slide 33, which you have up right now. You have, I'm assuming that's is that between now and 2040?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So I'm a little surprised that the reclaimed water, I mean, conservation doesn't show up on the slide at all. I don't know if that's figured into another column or if it just doesn't exist, or reclaimed water is pretty low. So it becomes clear to me that we're not going to conserve or reclaim our way out of growth. But I'm wondering if there's any way to increase what we could get out of that column, and then maybe a conservation column.
Yep. And with the slides, conservation is more of a demand management. It does reduce the demand, whereas the supply slide are sort of those water sources that can be used to help meet the demand.
Okay.
So on the conservation side, yes, we've identified about 50 million gallons a day of savings. You know, the key to conservation is participation, and that we've identified a series of best management practices. Now the challenge is, how do we get the water users, and I'm talking for public water supply, you know, the people that live there, to implement those measures? You know, is it cost share incentives? Is it mandating? You know, what is it that's going to get individuals to endorse conservation and implement?
That's my point, Mark, is it's before we start building really expensive projects, I want to make sure we've sort of exhausted what we can do on the conservation side, because it's a heck of a lot more efficient.
Yes. Yep. And just one thing that I wanted to mention, when Mr. Butler asked the question, these project options, the way they were developed is we worked with the stakeholders in identifying potential projects. And the 85 that were identified as part of this effort are pretty much the stakeholder-driven projects and potential project options, as well as some water management district options that were identified.
Got
And
it.
again, these are options for which users can choose from. Your comment regarding reclaimed water is that, and you're right, we're not going to be able to reclaim water ourselves out of this. But that's really the projected flow increase of wastewater over the next 20 years.
Okay.
So we're still projecting pretty much 100% reuse in this area.
Okay. Mr. Bergeron, you have a question? Mr. Bergeron, can you unmute yourself?
How's that?
There you go.
Okay. Kind of a general question. Certain amount of quantity of water that's resource on the surface, and then there's a certain volume that's that we're taking from the aquifer. As we're proceeding forward with Everglades restoration, which obviously certain amount of our fresh water is being discharged out rivers in quantities that are not compatible with the environment. When we're able to store water in reservoirs that laid on the half of the Everglades that over time was drained and where we live today for water supply. How will that help us to achieve the water supply for future growth when we're not discharging water into the Atlantic or the Gulf, and we have compatible water levels for conservation, compatible with the environment? Once this system is, as we continue to go forward with reservoirs or underground storage, where we're not wasting surface fresh water, how much will that help to achieve the quantity of water projecting the future growth and needs over the next 20 years?
Well, for this area, as you know, it's at the top of the system, and many of those storage features are Lake Okeechobee and south. So in this area, what we're looking at is some stormwater capture, and that's but also looking at the lakes, and we have the chain of lakes here, and you're aware that we are developing a reservation for the Kissimmee River and chain of lakes that is looking to reserve water from the chain of lakes and Kissimmee River for the restored part of the river, and that rulemaking is going on right now. So capturing excess water is good. The challenge is, as we know, is how do you store that? And in this area being at the top of the system, we're using stormwater capture projects, but nothing on the scale of some of the reservoir projects proposed as part of SERP.
Okay. That's what I kind of thought for this particular area, and this is in the upper Kissimmee Basin, I guess, that we're
Correct.
primarily talking about.
Yes, and you go from the urbanized area through agriculture and pasture down to Lake Okeechobee.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Colonel Roman, you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate your presentation, Mark. It's a lot of material to digest. Having visited Osceola County in particular, I noticed that there's a lot of growth in that whole region. And my question has to do with how do we balance all of that growth in those counties in terms of water? And how do wetlands factor in to that whole analysis?
That's a good question. And as part of the planning effort, state statute directs our water supply planning efforts to identify sufficient sources of water to meet the needs. But there's a limit to traditional sources, and that's why we've identified what's traditional and what's alternative. And that, when we go ahead and identify what's the sustainable limit of that traditional source, in this case, the upper Florida aquifer, we need to take into account the needs of the natural systems, and that includes the aquifer itself and any of the surface features that depend on that flow or that water level, and that would include the wetlands as well as the springs. So, those are some of the needs. Those are some of the constraints in the way of developing those sources for human purposes.
Do you have an example, Mark, that you can share that would put a picture onto what you just described?
Sure. Sure. Toho Water Authority, and looking towards the future through their own work and through working with the Water Management District, had identified the limit to the upper Florida aquifer, and that Cypress Lakes wellfield, the lower Florida aquifer, the brackish water project was designed to make up the shortfall of what their projected needs are versus what they could get from the upper Florida and the traditional source. So typically those constraints for natural systems, and there's also minimum flows and levels for different lakes and other natural systems that Southwest and St. John's has, all constrain what we can pull from that system. And we talked about those two MFLs, the two springs, tripping between 2025 and 2030. Yeah, so there's another example that the utility or the users, and it's more than just utilities, the users are going to have to look at alternative water supply so that we don't cause harm to those natural systems.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Colonel Roman. If there are no other questions from the board, we'll switch over to public comment now. And I want to remind the public, just push *9 if you're using a cell phone on your phone, and *6 will unmute you. Sean, do we have any public comment? We can wait a second.
No one has raised their hand yet, sir, but we are waiting for that. So if folks could raise their hands if they're interested in public comment, we will call on them. I see we have our first person with the raised their hand. Mr. Billy Kempfer.
Yes, my name is Billy Kempfer. I am the co-chairman of the CFWI conservation team on the agriculture side. My concern, the language was added a long time ago, adding the term brackish, where traditionally anything above 250 parts per million chlorides, 500 total dissolved solids was considered non-potable. And in it with that brackish term, and in order to, and I assume this is because of the Cypress well field, I don't know, but the public water supply folks put an upper limit of brackish at 3,000 parts per million chlorides. There are multiple, in fact, most of my water, although it's considered CFWI, is actually in Brevard County along with Deseret. There are multiple other ranchers that are also getting water out of the upper Florida in the form of artesian water. Just for example, the volume between us and Deseret, I checked with St. John, and we're permitted together with 40.7 MGD. So we're a very large user of water, and our chlorides are already, mine, we've been monitoring for about 10 years, and mine are already running from the mid 3s to the low 4s. Our highest well ever was 440, and that was several years ago. And now this year, or last May, we monitor every May, and last year it was back below 400. So we've been stable for a long time. One of the ranchers I did talk to in north or central Brevard that used to be able to use theirs for irrigation, theirs is already so high now. He says that they cannot irrigate; they can only use it for drinking water for their cattle. But I am concerned. I cannot find any, right now the 3,000 number has gone away, but I've not been satisfied with the protection that we're getting, as Mr. Butler was asking about the interface between the two aquifers. I'm afraid of what could happen to us if the salinity increases, and then all of a sudden ours is, our water is no longer usable for us. So I'm preparing, we're getting ready to draft the letter to CFWI referring to all of this. And as Mark was referring to a while ago about the amount of pressure, because there used to be a lot of wells that flowed in the Kissimmee area that are no longer flowing. And I know we've had wells that have lost a lot of pressure already. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kempfer. Mr. Ritter, I see your hands up. If you're ready, you can go ahead and talk.
Yes, yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Mark, as always, great presentation. I've enjoyed your water users forum, and this was a very good walkthrough on the CFWI. And really, I really don't have much of a comment. I have a question, and maybe it's something that you could add into this presentation in the future, and that is concerning the Kissimmee River Reservation. I've always been curious how that fits in with the CFWI, and that's basically all I had.
Thanks, Mr. Ritter. Mark, if you have an answer for that and you'd like to take a stab at it quickly, feel free.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we do recognize the reservation in the CFWI document, and in recognition of that reservation and the rural development, you won't find projects pulling from the chain of lakes, with the understanding that most of that water will be needed for the reservation. Yeah, but so it is represented in the document. The rulemaking process is documented, and in the next 5-year update, we'll go ahead and incorporate the reservation and the results of the rulemaking.
Thank you, Mark. Is there any other comments from the public?
No, sir, not at this time. If we could wait maybe 30 more seconds for folks to make sure they
Sure.
have a chance to raise their hand or press *9 on their phone to raise their hand.
Mr. Butler, is your hand raised? Or is that left over?
All right, Mr. Chairman, there are no more public commenters at this time.
Great. Well, thanks so much. I want to thank you all for joining us for our Lunch and Learn. A recording of this meeting is going to be made available on our YouTube page, the district's YouTube page. And I really want to thank our technical staff for allowing us to join together remotely. It's really worked out well, and I appreciate it. Thank you all for joining us. Have a great day and stay healthy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.